Gunfire shattered the frozen silence of the Bitterroot Mountains, waking a man who had spent a decade trying to disappear. He thought his fighting days were buried under 6 feet of dirt, until destiny arrived on a dying horse, bleeding, desperate, and hunted by the most ruthless killers in Montana. Winter in the Montana Territory of 1888 was not merely a season, it was an executioner. For Helena Jennings, the biting cold was the least of her immediate concerns. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath, tasting of copper and frost, as she forced her exhausted legs to keep moving through knee-deep snow. Behind her, echoing through the jagged canyons of the Bitterroot Range, came the distinct, terrifying sound of hounds baying and men shouting. Helena was not a frontierswoman. Just weeks prior, she had been a bookkeeper in the booming rail town of Helena, living a quiet, unassuming life. That all ended the night she stayed late in the office of Percival Higgins, the town's wealthiest railroad baron, and accidentally uncovered a hidden ledger. It wasn't just a book of numbers. It was a manifesto of murder, detailing Higgins's payments to Caleb Rust and his gang of cutthroats to slaughter homesteaders and seize their land for the railway. When Higgins caught her reading it, Helena knew she had 2 choices: die quietly in that office or run. She chose to run. She stole the ledger, stole a roan gelding, and fled into the unforgiving wilderness, hoping to reach the federal marshals in Idaho. But the wilderness was cruel, and Caleb Rust was crueler. Now, her horse was dead, shot out from under her a mile back. The heavy wool of her skirt was frozen solid at the hem, dragging her down like an anchor. She clutched the leather-bound ledger to her chest, her fingers numb and blue inside her ruined gloves. The snapping of twigs and the crunch of heavy boots grew louder. "Spread out! She can't have gone far with a bullet in her leg!" The gravelly voice of Emmett Hayes, Rust's second in command, boomed through the pines. Helena hadn't realized she was shot until she looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across her left thigh. The adrenaline had masked the pain, but as she stopped to hide behind the massive trunk of a fallen ponderosa pine, agony flared through her nerve endings. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her vision blurred. She was going to die here, alone in the ice, and the men who killed her would burn the only proof of their atrocities. 2 miles higher up the ridge, Wyatt Miller was perfectly content with the silence. Wyatt was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he inhabited. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard streaked with early gray and eyes the color of a winter sky. He had retreated to this isolated peak 10 years ago. Once a highly decorated scout for the cavalry, Wyatt had seen enough blood and betrayal to last 3 lifetimes. He built a cabin hidden deep in a box canyon, trading his rifle for snare lines and his uniform for buckskin. He spoke to no one, relying only on the mountain to sustain him. He was checking a trap line near the edge of a steep ravine when the wind shifted, bringing with it a scent that made his blood run cold: gunpowder and sweat. Wyatt froze, his instincts instantly overriding his peaceful existence. He unslung the heavy Sharps buffalo rifle from his shoulder and moved with a terrifying silence toward the ridge overlooking the valley. Peering through the dense canopy of snow-laden branches, his sharp eyes caught movement. 3 men, armed to the teeth, were fanning out across a clearing below. They were track hounds, moving with the predatory grace of killers. But it was what they were tracking that made Wyatt's jaw tighten. Curled at the base of a fallen tree, practically blending into the snow, was a woman. Wyatt watched as Emmett Hayes spotted her, a cruel grin splitting his scarred face. Hayes raised his repeater. Not to kill, not yet, but to toy with her. He fired a shot that sent bark exploding inches from Helena's head. She flinched, clutching a book to her chest. But she didn't beg. She simply glared at him with a defiance that struck something deep within Wyatt's dormant soul. "Walk away," a voice in Wyatt's head whispered. "It's not your fight. You left the world behind." But as Hayes stepped forward, drawing a long hunting knife to finish the job, Wyatt knew he couldn't let it happen. The ghosts of his past demanded he act. Wyatt exhaled slowly, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He settled the heavy barrel of the sharps against a pine branch, adjusting for the wind and the drop. The mountain man closed one eye. Down in the clearing, Hayes grabbed Helena by the hair. "End of the line, little lady. Mr. Rust sends his regards." A thunderclap shattered the valley. It was a sound so loud, so concussive, it shook the snow from the branches. Before the echo even faded, Emmett Hayes was dead, dropped instantly by a massive .50 caliber slug that took him squarely in the chest. The remaining two outlaws panicked, spinning wildly, trying to find the shooter. "Sniper! Up on the ridge!" one yelled. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He dropped the single-shot sharps, drew his twin Colt revolvers, and launched himself down the steep, snow-covered incline. He slid over the ice using the trees for cover, moving faster than any normal man had a right to. When he hit the clearing, he was a force of nature. 2 rapid shots dropped the second outlaw. The third man, a young kid barely out of his teens, took one look at the towering, wild-eyed mountain man bearing down on him and fled back the way he came, screaming for Caleb Rust. Wyatt let him go. The warning would buy him time. He holstered his weapons and knelt beside the woman. Helena looked up at him, her vision swimming. She saw a giant of a man clad in furs, his face rugged and hard, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle as he checked her leg. "You're bleeding badly," Wyatt said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that hadn't been used for conversation in years. The ledger," Helena gasped, refusing to let go of the book. "Don't let them take it." "I don't care about a book," Wyatt said, scooping her into his massive arms effortlessly. "I care about keeping you breathing. Hold on to me." Helena rested her head against his chest, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart the last thing she felt before the darkness finally claimed her. Helena awoke to the smell of wood smoke, roasting pine nuts, and something distinctly herbal. She opened her eyes, her eyelids feeling like they were lined with sand. The harsh, blinding white of the snow was gone, replaced by the warm, flickering amber glow of a massive stone hearth. She was lying on a bed of thick, surprisingly soft wolf pelts in a cabin that looked like it had grown organically out of the mountain itself. The logs were massive, chinked with mud and moss, and the walls were adorned with dried herbs, traps, and primitive tools. It was a rugged sanctuary, completely hidden from the cruelty of the world she had just fled. Panic surged as she remembered the outlaws, the gunshot, the snow. She shot up, gasping, only to be hit by a wave of searing pain from her thigh. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." A deep voice rumbled from the shadows. Wyatt stepped into the light of the fire. He had shed his heavy winter furs, wearing a simple linen shirt that stretched tight across his broad shoulders and suspenders over heavy canvas trousers. Helena instinctively pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room. "Where am I? Where are my clothes?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "You're safe." "For now," Wyatt replied, setting a steaming tin cup on a small wooden stump near the bed. "Your clothes were soaked in blood and melted snow. If I didn't get you out of them, the frostbite would have killed you before the blood loss did. I patched the bullet hole. It went clean through the meat of your thigh, missed the artery and the bone. You were lucky." Helena swallowed hard, her initial modesty fading as the reality of her survival set in. She looked at the man. He was intimidating, with a hardened face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone, but there was no malice in his blue eyes. Only a quiet, intense vigilance. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "Wyatt." "Wyatt Miller," he said, pulling up a chair carved from a single tree stump and sitting near the fire. "And you're a long way from a parlor, miss." Helena Jennings." She hesitated, looking around the cabin. "My book. Where is my ledger?" Wyatt reached beside his chair and tossed the leather-bound book onto the foot of the bed. "It's right there. You nearly died clinging to it. I'm guessing it's the reason 3 heavily armed men were trying to butcher you in my woods." Helena pulled the ledger close, running her hand over the cover. She looked at Wyatt, assessing whether she could trust him. He had saved her life, undressed her to save her from freezing, and stitched her wound. If he wanted to harm her, he already would have. "It's a record," Helena began, her voice gaining strength. "Percival Higgins, the railroad magnate, in Helena. He's been hiring Caleb Rust's gang to terrorize and murder families who refuse to sell their land for the new rail expansion. The money trails are all in here. Bribes to judges, payments for ammunition, everything. If I can get this to the federal marshals in Idaho, Higgins will hang." Wyatt's expression darkened at the name Caleb Rust. It was a name that carried a heavy, bloody weight in the territory. Rust was a monster who enjoyed his work a little too much. "You're a fool, Helena Jennings," Wyatt said bluntly, tossing another log onto the fire. "Higgins practically owns the territory. Even if you make it to Idaho, half the marshals are likely on his payroll. And Caleb Rust? He doesn't stop. He's like a wolverine. He'll track you until one of you is dead." "I had to try," Helena snapped, her eyes flashing with sudden, fierce anger. "I couldn't just sit there and balance the books while innocent people were being slaughtered. Maybe you're content hiding up here in the dirt like an animal, turning a blind eye to the world, but I couldn't do it." The words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Wyatt stared at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. For a moment, Helena thought she had pushed him too far. The silence stretched, heavy and tense. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of Wyatt's mouth twitched upward in the ghost of a smile. "You've got fire, Miss Jennings. I'll give you that. But fire won't stop bullets." He stood up and walked to a heavy oak chest, opening it to reveal an arsenal of carefully maintained firearms. He pulled out a Winchester lever-action rifle and began wiping it down with an oiled rag. "I'm not hiding because I'm a coward, Helena," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, sorrowful register. "I'm hiding because I know exactly what men like Higgins and Rust are capable of. 10 years ago, a gang much like Rust's hit my homestead while I was out hunting. I came back to ashes. My wife. My little boy." He stopped, swallowing hard, his eyes briefly reflecting the dancing flames before hardening back into ice. "I hunted down every last one of the men who did it, killed them all, and when it was over, I realized it didn't bring my family back. It just left me hollow. So, I came up here, vowed I'd never pull a trigger on another man." Helena felt a sharp pang of guilt in her chest. She looked at the hardened mountain man, suddenly seeing the profound grief beneath his rough exterior. "Wyatt, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have spoken like that." Wyatt shook his head, sliding a bullet into the chamber of the Winchester with a sharp clack. "Doesn't matter now. I broke that vow today. I killed one of Rust's men down in that clearing, and I let the other run. Which means by tomorrow morning, Caleb Rust is going to bring his entire gang up this mountain. They'll follow my tracks right to our front door." Helena's blood ran cold. "Because of me. I brought them to you." "You brought a fight to my door," Wyatt corrected, turning to look at her, his blue eyes burning with a sudden fierce protectiveness. "But I'm the one who invited them in when I pulled that trigger. They're coming for the ledger, and they're coming for you." He walked over to the bed, looking down at her. Despite the grime, the pale exhaustion, and the fear in her eyes, Wyatt noticed for the first time how strikingly beautiful she was. But more than that, he admired her courage. She was just a bookkeeper, yet she had risked everything to do what was right. It stirred something inside him that he thought had died a decade ago, a desperate need to protect. "We have a few hours before the storm breaks," Wyatt said, his voice commanding and steady. "When it hits, it'll cover our tracks. But until then, we need to fortify this cabin. Caleb Rust thinks he's hunting a frightened girl. He doesn't know he just walked into the den of a very angry bear." As Wyatt began barricading the heavy timber door, Helena gripped the ledger. The fear was still there. But as she watched this solitary mountain man prepare to wage a one-man war for her, a strange, profound sense of safety washed over her. She was in the crosshairs of the deadliest men in the West, but she was no longer alone. Wind battered the stout timber walls of the cabin, bringing with it a blizzard that swallowed the mountain in a sea of blinding white. Inside, The crackle of the hearth was drowned out by the metallic, rhythmic clatter of Wyatt Miller preparing for war. He shoved heavy iron bolts into the doorframe, dragged a massive oak table across the primary window, and laid out boxes of brass cartridges with chilling precision. Helena sat by the fire, her leg tightly bandaged and throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. She watched Wyatt move with the fluid, calculated grace of a seasoned cavalryman. He wasn't just a man living in the woods. He was a phantom of the Indian Wars, a survivor who knew the intimate dance of life and death. He tossed a heavy, oiled Colt revolver onto the furs beside her. 6 rounds, Wyatt said, his voice cutting through the howling wind. If anyone gets past me and comes through that door, you don't hesitate. Point it at their chest and pull the trigger until it clicks. Do you understand? Helena stared at the heavy iron weapon. Just yesterday, her biggest concern had been balancing ledgers and keeping ink off her cuffs. Now, she was holding an instrument of death. She met Wyatt's icy blue eyes and nodded, wrapping her trembling fingers around the walnut grip. I understand. They didn't have to wait long. Just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, plunging the canyon into darkness, the attack began. It wasn't heralded by a battle cry, but by a heavy, thunderous volley of rifle fire that tore through the cabin's thick wooden shutters, showering the room in splinters and dust. Helena screamed, covering her head as she ducked behind the stone hearth. Miller! A voice roared from the blizzard outside, amplified by the sheer volume of a man accustomed to giving brutal orders. This is Caleb Rust, and I ain't alone. I've got Sheriff Langdon out here with me. You're harboring a fugitive and stolen property. Send the girl out with the book, and we ride away. Helena's heart plummeted into her stomach. Sheriff Langdon, the chief law enforcement officer of the county, was riding with the very outlaws he was sworn to hang. She had been right. Percival Higgins had bought the entire territory. Wyatt didn't bother shouting back. Instead, he kicked open a small firing port he had carved into the logs years ago, aimed his Winchester into the dark, and fired twice. A scream echoed through the snow, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the frozen earth. The negotiations were officially over. The mountain erupted. Gunfire flashed from the tree line like fatal fireflies. Wyatt moved from window to window, his rifle barking a deadly rhythm. He was a master of his environment. Every time an outlaw tried to rush the cabin, they either found a bullet or stumbled into one of the bear traps Wyatt had hidden under the fresh snowfall. The agonizing screams of Rust's men added a macabre harmony to the roaring wind. But there were too many of them. Reload for me! Wyatt tossed an empty Winchester to Helena and snatched a loaded one from the table. Helena scrambled to grab the brass cartridges, her hands slick with nervous sweat. She forced the bullets into the loading gate, her mind laser-focused on the mechanical task. She was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered. She was part of the defense. She slid the loaded rifle across the floor to Wyatt just as a massive crash shook the back of the cabin. A heavy pine log smashed through the rear window, tearing the shutters off their iron hinges. Snow and freezing wind blasted into the room. Before Wyatt could turn, a massive brute of a man, Josiah, one of Rust's enforcers, crawled through the broken window, raising a double-barreled shotgun right at Wyatt's back. Time seemed to freeze. Wyatt was pinned down by suppressing fire from the front, completely exposed to the rear. "Wyatt!" Helena screamed. She didn't think. Instinct, born of a desperate will to live, took over. She raised the heavy Colt revolver with both hands, aimed at Josiah's massive chest, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil threw her backward, but the bullet found its mark. Josiah grunted, his shotgun discharging wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed backward out of the window. Wyatt spun around, staring at the shattered window, and then locked eyes with Helena. A silent look of profound respect passed between them, but the victory was short-lived. A glowing orange light flickered through the cracks in the walls, accompanied by the distinct smell of kerosene. "They're burning us out!" Wyatt yelled, grabbing his heavy buffalo coat and throwing a thick wool blanket over Helena. "The roof will cave in 3 minutes. We have to move." "Where?" Helena cried, coughing as thick black smoke began to fill the cabin. Wyatt rushed to the center of the room and kicked away a large braided rug, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor. "I dug a root cellar 10 years ago. It connects to a natural cave system that empties out a quarter-mile up the ridge. Let's go." He hoisted Helena onto his back, securing her arms over his shoulders, and grabbed his Sharps rifle. Together they descended into the dark, damp earth, leaving the burning cabin and Wyatt's solitary past behind them. They emerged onto a high, desolate ridge just as the cabin's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks that illuminated the valley. The blizzard was blinding, stinging their faces with ice crystals. Wyatt carried Helena effortlessly, his massive boots punching holes through waist-deep snowdrifts. They pushed forward for hours, guided only by Wyatt's intimate knowledge of the treacherous terrain. By dawn, the storm had broken, leaving behind a crystalline, frozen world under a brilliant blue sky. They reached the edge of Lolo Pass, a narrow, treacherous gorge that served as the only gateway into Idaho territory. But they were not alone. Looking back down the winding mountain trail, Wyatt spotted them. Caleb Rust, Sheriff Langdon, and 4 remaining outlaws, riding exhausted but relentless mountain ponies. They were tracking the deep gouges Wyatt had left in the fresh snow. "They won't stop," Wyatt breathed, setting Helena down behind a massive granite boulder overlooking the narrow pass. "If we try to outrun them on foot, they'll pick us off in the open." "What do we do?" Helena asked, clutching the ledger to her chest. Wyatt checked the action on his Sharps rifle, his face hardening into a mask of pure, lethal resolve. "We don't outrun them. We break them right here." He positioned Helena safely in a rock crevice. "When the shooting stops, you walk west. You'll hit the town of Wallace by nightfall. Find Judge Hiram Knowles. He's a federal circuit judge, a man of God, and the only man with the power to hang Percival Higgins. Don't trust anyone else." "Wyatt, no!" Helena grabbed his sleeve, tears finally springing to her eyes. "You can't fight them all. You'll die." Wyatt reached out, his rough, calloused hand gently brushing a tear from her freezing cheek. "For 10 years, I've been a ghost," he whispered softly. "You reminded me what it means to be alive, Helena. I won't let them take that light out of the world." Before she could stop him, Wyatt vaulted over the rocks, sliding down the steep embankment directly into the center of the narrow pass. He stood like an avenging titan in the middle of the trail, his buffalo coat billowing in the wind, his rifle raised. The outlaws rounded the bend and pulled their horses to a violent halt. Caleb Rust, a lean, wiry man with a face scarred by smallpox and cold, dead eyes, spurred his horse forward, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Well, look at this. The mountain man wants to die on his feet," Rust taunted, drawing his revolver. "Kill him, boys!" Wyatt fired the Sharps. The concussive blast echoed off the canyon walls. Sheriff Langdon didn't even have time to scream as he was blown backward out of his saddle. Wyatt dropped the single-shot rifle and drew his twin Colts, walking slowly forward, firing with terrifying mechanical precision. 2 more outlaws fell under Wyatt's relentless barrage. But as Wyatt turned his sights on Rust, his right gun clicked empty. Rust fired. A bullet tore through Wyatt's left shoulder, spinning the giant man around and dropping him to one knee in the blood-stained snow. Helena screamed from the ridge, raising her revolver, but the angle was too steep. Rust spurred his horse, charging directly at Wyatt, preparing to trample him and deliver a point-blank killing shot. But Wyatt Miller was not a man who surrendered to death. With a savage, guttural roar, Wyatt lunged upward as the horse passed. He grabbed Rust by his leather duster and ripped the outlaw from his saddle. The 2 men crashed into the snow in a violent tangle of limbs and fury. Rust slashed wildly with a Bowie knife, slicing a deep gash across Wyatt's ribs. But the mountain man didn't flinch. Driven by the memory of the family he lost and the fierce love for the woman he was trying to save, Wyatt caught Rust's wrist, snapping it with a sickening crunch. He drove his heavy fist into Rust's face once, twice, 3 times, until the ruthless killer finally went limp in the snow. Silence rushed back into the canyon, broken only by the ragged breathing of the last man standing. Helena scrambled down the icy rocks, dropping to her knees in the snow beside Wyatt. She ripped strips from her petticoat, frantically binding his bleeding shoulder. "You're going to live," she sobbed, her hands covered in his blood. "You hear me? I am not letting you die on me, Wyatt Miller." Wyatt coughed, a weak smile touching his lips as he looked up at her tear-streaked face. "I ain't planning on dying today, Helena. Not when I finally have a reason to live." 3 days later, Helena Jennings stood in a warm, wood-paneled courthouse in Wallace, Idaho. She placed the blood-stained, water-warped ledger directly onto the desk of Judge Hiram Knowles. Within 48 hours, federal marshals raided Percival Higgins's mansion in Helena, arresting him on 14 counts of murder, extortion, and conspiracy. The corrupt empire was brought down by the courage of a single bookkeeper, but Helena didn't stay to watch Higgins hang. She had somewhere else to be. High up in the Bitterroot Mountains, spring was finally breaking through the frost. A new cabin was being built in the valley, larger than the last, with wide windows to let in the sun. Wyatt Miller stood on the porch, his arm in a sling, watching Helena ride up the trail on a newly purchased Appaloosa. She had traded her wool city skirts for practical denim and leather, her chin held high, radiating a quiet, unbreakable strength. Wyatt stepped off the porch to meet her, taking the reins of her horse. He looked at the woman who had chased the shadows from his heart, and he knew that while the Wild West was full of outlaws and cruelty, it was also full of redemption. He pulled her down from the saddle, wrapping his good arm around her waist, and kissed her under the vast, open Montana sky. They had survived the worst the frontier had to offer, and now the rest of their lives was entirely theirs to build. Did this Wild West tale of survival, redemption, and unexpected romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved Wyatt and Helena's fight against the odds, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical dramas. Drop a comment below telling us what you would do if you found that ledger. Your support helps us bring more incredible frontier tales to life every week.
Hi, my name is Pham Nguyen, the owner and manager of Shattered Justice Echoes. After watching the video, she was chased by